We'll get started in just a moment. My name is Bob Hertman. I'm the director of the Center for Religion and Spirituality here at Marymount University. The center is part of LMU Extension, which has given us basically an opportunity to be together tonight. Full-time students, undergraduates, graduates, faculty, staff, and extension students, people who from the community who know about our programs through LMU Extension. I have a very important announcement. If you have a cell phone, or a pager, or any of those devices, people might have pagers, well, sometimes they do. Anyway, could you put them in silent mode or turn them off? Thank you so much, just as a favor to all of us. You probably picked this up on your way in. It's tonight's program is very simple, and it's just right here on that sheet. And it's my good pleasure to welcome you to this evening lecture by Gary Macy on the topic of the hidden history of women's ordination. We got calls from different parts of Los Angeles today, and I was just curious, are there people here who came here tonight from Pasadena, the San Gabriel Valley?
Oh, wow.
Are there people here who came from Orange County? Are there people here from San Bernardino, Riverside counties? No, they didn't make it. Okay. From Santa Barbara, Ventura? They're on the way.
They're on the way.
Very good. Are there people here who are here for the very first time at LMU? Very much. Well, welcome. Welcome one and all. You may or may not have heard that tonight's talk is the second in our series on women and religion. So first, we had a workshop on Saturday on embodied spirituality. There's one more offering this term in May on spirituality and motherhood. And last term, we also focused on women and religion, and we had Rosemary Bradford Ruther here. Now, I want to say a word of thanks to one of our adjunct professors and former assistant director in the Center for Religion and Spirituality, who gave us, Cynthia Bond, who gave us the idea of having 1 year of focus on women and religion. For us, it was a no-brainer, because every time we hold a course or hold a talk or an event, it's a good amount of women that show up. I mean, it's the majority. I hate to say it, guys, we're lagging behind, that's for sure. And the focus of this evening's talk is a focus on history and women, and also the history of women in a way that touches on a very important issue that can also be viewed in a justice perspective. And we're going to hear more about that, of course, from Professor Macy. I need to. One thing you get when you get the organizer is you get to make a couple of commercials. We are selling Gary's book over here at a special price, $28.50 with tax. And after, just see our volunteer, Mary Kay Monroe, who's selling the books over at this table. We are also holding. We're going to soon have our summer theology session this year. We're going to have a course with Father Ed Foley on Catholic Theological Union on historical and theological reflections on the new missal, liturgy and the new missal. We're also going to have Scripture Week at the end of June with a focus on biblical apocalypticism. So feel free to pick up our brochures outside. Michael McLeod, our assistant director, is standing by the door. He and I will be at the table and certainly at the reception as well afterward. I need to thank people who made tonight possible. I would like to especially thank my colleague Anna Harrison. She and I got together to talk about this specific theme about a year ago, right? And it brought us to tonight. We also want to thank the many co-sponsors of this event here on campus. The Catholic Studies Program, Father Jose Padenes, who's director. The History Department, John H. Griever, who is professor and chair, but also a special thanks to Tony Perrin for helping us with tonight's reception following the lecture. The Department of Theological Studies, Jeff Seiker, professor and chair. Department of Women's Studies, Nancy Dabra, professor and chair. And the Office of Resident Ministry, Dino Entak, director. Thank you, all of these sister institutions here at LMU for your support for this event. And as I just mentioned, there will be a reception after the talk and the discussion, and it's going to be held in the History Village, which is on the 3rd floor of this very building, and we'll have a little bit of directions for getting there after the talk. I want to also thank Father Tom Rausch. I will introduce him when the time comes. Father Rausch has agreed to serve as the moderator of the discussion period tonight. And so now I'd like to invite my colleague, Anna Harrison, up to introduce our presenter.
Thanks so much, Bob, and to all of you, good evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight medieval historian and theologian Gary Macy, John Nobili, S.J., Professor of Theology at Santa Clara University. Dr. Macy is the author of several books and dozens of articles which have both contributed to the important historiographical discussion about the Church in the Middle Ages and which have helped to shape current scholarly debate on the theology and history of the Eucharist and of women's ordination. Among Dr. Macy's books are The Banquet's Wisdom, A Short History of the Theologies of the Lord's Supper, Treasures from the Storehouse, Essays on the Medieval Eucharist, and more recently, The Hidden History of Women's Ordination. Dr. Macy's scholarship is widely recognized. In 1991-92, he was Herodotus Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and during the 2005-2006 academic year, Dr. Macy was the Senior Luce Fellow at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina. I hope you don't mind if I say that tonight is a particularly special one for me. I had the great delight of reading Dr. Macy's work first when I was a graduate student, and it is always very exciting to meet on footnotes. And Dr. Macy remains one of my fondest footnotes. This is no small matter. In their best expression, footnotes are, of course, an individual scholar's recognition of her indebtedness to the work of other scholars, both among the living and among the dead. They signal the recognition that the work each of us does is always, in some sense, a collaborative endeavor. Footnotes are therefore about community. I suspect that many in our audience, from full professors to our wonderful young student scholars, will join me in acknowledging Dr. Macy as a valued member of our community, a community characterized in part by a love of learning and a desire to tackle tough and important topics that are relevant not just to the historian of the distant past, but to modern women and men more broadly. And it is in this spirit that I ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Gary Macy.
Thank you very, very much. I want to thank you all for the honor of inviting me to Loyola Marymount University. I have always had a very good experiences here. It was, in fact, my wife and I were just talking about this last night. It was 23 years ago that I first came to Loyola Marymount, and I was teaching at the University of San Diego then. And my wife and I threw 3 cases of wine in the back of the car and drove up for the College Theology Society, which was then being sponsored, I think, by John, I'm pretty sure by John Conley. Yeah. And we had a really good time. And every time I've come back to Loyola, it's been so gracious. It's just been wonderful. I particularly want to thank, of course, Robert Hurteau and the Center for Religion and Spirituality for inviting me to participate in Loyola Marymount's World in Religion series. And I'd like to also thank the co-sponsors of the talk tonight, the Department of Theological Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Women's Studies, Resident Ministry, and the Catholic Studies program. That's a great collaborative effort, a real community effort. I thank you so much. And of course, I want to thank Anna Harrison for her warm welcome of my wife and of I and her gracious introduction. And I will be talking more about community tonight, so the introduction is perfectly apt. What I was asked to do tonight is to give a summary of the research that I've been doing for about a dozen years now on the ordination of women. And I can't talk about all of that work for two reasons. First of all, there's not enough time. And secondly, the only one who wouldn't be bored to tears would be me. Because I really don't know when to shut up. So I'm going to try to keep it brief tonight and just talk about three different areas and maybe enter into a fourth area. And what I really hope to do is leave lots of time so that anyone who has questions can ask me questions and we can continue the discussion, because I will not be able to cover everything, of course. I want to look at first the evidence that exists for the ordination of women. Secondly, what ordination meant in the early church. This is a very important question. And finally, what roles ordained women played in the church. Those three areas. And then if I have time, I will address some of the implications of this history for the present, which of course is, I'm sure, on lots of people's minds. If I don't get to that, I'm sure the question period, that will come up in the question period. So first of all, evidence for the ordination of women. The evidence that women were considered ordained in the early Middle Ages is really quite striking. When popes in the 11th and 12th century made lists of different orders, they included those of women. In 1018, Benedict VIII conferred on the Cardinal Bishop of Porto the right to ordain bishops, priests, deacons, deaconesses, subdeacons, churches, and altars. This privilege was repeated by John the 19th in 1025 and by Leo the 9th in 1049. In 1026, thank you. In 1026, John the 19th conceded to the Bishop of Silva Candida, quote, the consecration of churches, altars, priests, clerics, deacons, or deaconesses for the whole Leonine city, end quote. Benedict IX continued this privilege in 1037 and also exempted from lay control, quote, priests, deacons, monks, housekeepers, clerics of whatever order or dignity, all holy women or deaconesses, end quote. Calixtus II, in a privilege of 1023 to the convent of the Holy Savior and St. Julia in Brescia, granted the abbess the right to seek the ordination of abbesses, nuns, and other clerics advanced to sacred orders from any bishop she wished. Not only popes, but bishops included women among the ordained. Bishop Gilbert of Limerick included the injunction in his handbook on the practice of the church, quote, the bishop ordains abbots, abbesses, priests, and the 6 other grades, end quote. The Chronicles of Tetmar, Bishop of Merseburg, who died in 1018, recorded that, quote, the same woman who at that time was 12 years old was veiled on Sunday, the calends of May, and on the next day ordained abbess. Now, it's a whole other interesting story why they were ordaining a 12-year-old as abbess, but I can't go into that right now. A 10th century letter of Otto, the Bishop of Vercelli, described the initiation of deaconesses in the earlier church as an ordination, and this is what he says. For the aid of men, devout women were ordained leaders of worship in the Holy Church, end quote. A number of medieval liturgical books include commissioning rites for women that they call ordinations, in the same way that commissioning rites for men are called ordinations. In fact, the rites for men and women are listed together in the books. Ordination rites for deaconesses are contained in the 8th century pontifical of Bishop Ecbert of York, in the influential 9th century Gregorian sacramentary, and in the 12th century Roman pontifical. The most complete liturgy for the ordination of a deaconess occurs in the 10th century Romano-Germanic pontifical. The ordination rite for a deaconess takes place within the Mass and begins with the instructions, quote, when the bishop blesses the deaconess, he places the orarium on her neck. However, when she proceeds to the church, she wears it around her neck so that both ends of the orarium are under her tunic. And this is the front piece of the book. And I love this picture because Mary here, during the Annunciation, is dressed exactly as the 10th century pontifical would describe a deaconess on her way to be ordained. She has a dalmatic on, which is this crosspiece thing. And here's the orarium. You see it's tucked in underneath, just the way they would describe it in the 10th century, in that 10th century ordinal. Now, why they would have a 10th century ordinal in a 12th century place? Easy. They couldn't afford a new book. Ordination rites for abbesses are also found in several important liturgical books. Now, this is ordination rites for abbesses. I was talking about ordination for deaconesses. Now, this is ordination rites for abbesses. The ancient Spanish liturgy, known as the Mozarabic rite, contains an ordination ritual in which an abbess received both the mitre and the staff, in indicating the episcopal stature of Spanish abbesses. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Interestingly enough, the Mozarabic ordination rite for an abbot does not include the reception of a mitre. Two different versions of the Gregorian sacramentary combine the ordination rites for abbots and abbesses. So there's one ordination rite. You know, if you're going to ordain an abbot or an abbess, do this. They're exactly the same. That actually occurs in a couple of other liturgies where it says if you're going to ordain a deacon or a deaconess, just say these same prayers. Saves space, saves time. Yeah. The Romano-Germanic pontifical contains two separate ordination rites for abbesses, ordination rites for different kinds of abbesses, abbesses of nuns and abbesses of canonesses. The consecration of a new abbess was also described as an ordination in the 12th century Roman pontifical. So we have a whole set of liturgical books that talk about the ordination, that have the rites for the ordination of women, deaconesses, and abbesses. Now, those are just the most prestigious references to the ordination of women from the 6th through the 12th century. Many others from bishops, theologians, wills, charters, chronicles, and vitae, the lives of the saints, could be recounted here. But then I would have time for nothing else. And by now, many, or at least some of you, are wondering what these references are referring. This is how I got started on this research. I found all these documents that talked about the ordination of women, and I thought, well, women weren't ordained, so what could this possibly mean? Now, the first thing you might think is, well, these can't be real ordinations, because as early as the 12th century, in the famous collection of laws called the Decretum by the monk and canon lawyer Gratian, it clearly states, or Gratian clearly states, in one of the rare occasions when he gives his own opinion, that, quote, women can attain neither to the priesthood or even to the diaconate, end quote, which would seem to contradict the fact that we have ordination rites for deaconesses down through the centuries. More pointedly, have not the standard histories of Christianity always assumed that women had never been ordained? Something happened. 2 points, both of which I'm sure have already occurred to you, are worth making. First, something changed. Women stopped being referred to as ordained. And more to the point, at some point in Western Christianity, it was taught and believed that women never had been ordained. Now, if this had not occurred, if it had never happened, if those two things had never happened, the references to the ordination of women that I just gave you would not be the least bit problematic. The strangeness of these assumptions about women can be more clearly understood when compared to the situation of men in Christian history. Throughout the history of Christianity, one finds references to the ordination of men. There are rites for the ordination of men. There are canonical requirements for the ordination of men. There are particular men depicted as ordained, and a number of roles limited to men are included among the lists of ordained ministries, just as there are for women. But no scholar, of which I am aware, questions whether the references to men are in fact mistaken or not real ordinations. Men are assumed to have been ordained in all such references because the references say they were, And there's never been a period in Christian history or a Christian group that ever denied or denies that men were or are capable of being ordained. One can then assume that if there had never been a period in the history of Christianity when women had been judged incapable of ordination, references to their being ordained would be as unproblematic as references to men being ordained. Now that might seem obvious, but the obvious is often missed, and so worth pointing out. Secondly, and again, as you may have guessed, the definition, or better, the understanding of ordination used by the earlier sources I cited, and that assumed by Gratian, are different. The definition of ordination changed, and this is where an important discussion of community comes to play. For the first millennium of Christianity, the words ordo, ordinatio, and ordinare had a far different meaning than they would come to have in later centuries. Pierre Bonvenedin has argued that early Christians appropriated the language of ordination for their use in their communities from everyday usage, everyday Latin usage. And this everyday use of the term ordo and ordinare continued throughout the Middle Ages, even as a cursory glance at any thesaurus of medieval Latin would show. Ordo could refer simply to one's state of life, and ordinare would be used in its original sense of providing order, either in a political or in a metaphoric sense. In fact, ordinare in its base meaning simply means some method of ordination, of organization. So to put your books in alphabetical order is, in Latin, to ordain them. And once you've got them in place, that's an ordination, ordinatio. You can use it like that, the word like that in Latin, and people do. All right? So it doesn't have the same meaning as it does in English quite. And therefore, ordines, the plural of ordo in Latin, can be a reference to the jobs that are done in a certain group or society. So there's a famous medieval book called The Three Ordos: knights, monks, and farmers. Is that right? I think so. Okay. I have to check with Dr. Majewski. So that's your rank, where you are in your society, your job. Okay? In the Middle Ages, the word ordinatio and ordinare were used to describe the ceremony. So let me back up just a little bit to make this a little clearer. So within the Christian community, they would use this ordinary Latin word to talk about the different jobs that people had and how they allocated those jobs. That's all that meant. A community would pick a person to do a job, any job for the community. So priest, deacon, bishop, doorkeeper, acolyte, nun, priest, monk, abbot, abbess, whatever your new role in society was. The word ordinatio meant the selection of that person, so how you're going to pick them, and they pick them in different ways. Most often, interestingly, democratically, but we'll talk about that later. And then after the person was chosen, there would be a ceremony to install them into their new position within the community, and that was an ordination. But that ordination was only by that community for that community. You know, so if you were a priest in one community, you weren't a priest in another community. Your community picked you for a job in that community. Now, politics is politics, and people got moved around, but they weren't supposed to be. The early canons of the church will talk about a bishop who moves from one diocese to another as an adulterer. You know, you were picked by this community, you're a member of this community, you serve this community. Of course it happened, but that wasn't the idea. The idea was that the community, you would come from your own community, be picked by your community for a job in your community, but only within your community. Okay? So, in the Middle Ages, the word ordinatio and ordinare are used to describe not only the ceremony and installation of bishops, priests, deacons, and subdeacons, but also of porters, lectors, acolytes, exorcists, canons, abbots, abbesses, kings, queens, and empresses. They're all ordines, of course, because they're all particular roles that you play in the community. The terms could also apply to the consecration or establishment of a religious order, or of a monastery, or of admission to religious life. Sure, if you entered religious life, you were in a new position, a new job, a new role. As late as the 14th century, ordo could be used to designate the state of having received the sacrament of extreme unction. I know that sounds odd, but you were supposed to have died and you didn't, and that may, okay, I know, we don't want to go there. Marriage would certainly be referred to as an ordo, because you're entering a new position in the community, as late as the 15th century. And now that makes perfect sense, of course. An ordo was a group in the church that had a particular job or vocation. To quote Yves Congar, quote, ordination encompassed at the same time election as its starting point and consecration as its term. But instead of signifying, as happened from the beginning of the 12th century, the ceremony in which an individual received a power, henceforth possessed in such a way that it could never be lost, the words ordinare, ordinari, ordinatio signified the fact of being designated and consecrated to take up a certain place, or better, a certain function, an ordo, in the community and at its service, end quote. Ordination did not give a person the irrevocable and portable power, for instance, of consecrating the bread and wine or of leading the liturgy, but rather a particular community charged a person to play a leadership role within that community, and only within that community, and he or she would lead the liturgy because of the leadership role they played within the community. As the quotation from Cardinal Congar indicated, only in the 12th and 13th centuries did theologians and canonists devise, after lengthy debates, another definition of ordination. According to this definition, and this is the one that we are most familiar with, ordination granted the recipient not a position within the community, but a power that a person can exercise in any community. In fact, according to the 13th century theologians, ordination bestowed an indelible character on the soul of the ordained that marked them as different from other Christians. The central power that ordination granted was the power to consecrate the bread and wine at the altar, and so, over time, it took about 75 to 100 years to work this all out. Ordination was considered to include only those ordines that served at the altar. That is, the orders of priest, deacon, and subdeacon. All the other earlier orders were no longer considered to be orders at all. Now, as a part of this redefinition of orders, women were excluded from all the orders, including priest, deacon, and subdeacon. In fact, it was taught and believed, and still is, that women never performed any of the roles limited to those three orders. However, as we shall see, the picture is a little more complex than the standard histories would have us believe. And so this, in the third part of my talk, which is the longer part of my talk, I want to talk about some of the roles that women played once they were ordained as deaconesses or ordained as abbesses, or you could also be ordained as a nun and so on. And also these three strange roles that we don't know much about, episcopa, which is female bishop, female Latin for bishop, presbytera, which is the female in Latin for priest, and diaconissa, or diacona, which is Latin for deacon. Now, within this earlier understanding of ordination, women in the Middle Ages played a far larger role in the life of the church than they would in later centuries. In the early Middle Ages, they performed both sacramental and administrative functions that would be reserved to men after the 13th century. They celebrated Mass, distributed communion, read the Gospel, heard confessions, and preached. Some abbesses also exercised episcopal power, and indeed a few were considered bishops. The powerful abbess of Las Huelgas in Spain continued to wear her mitre and exercise her administrative episcopal power until 1874. I'll talk a little bit more about her later. We know most about her. First of all, the celebration of the Eucharist. Evidence from the 4th through the 11th centuries indicate that a few women led liturgies with the approval of at least some bishops. The scarcity of evidence does not necessarily mean that the practice was unusual, however. The sources that do survive, of necessity, have been compiled by an elite, almost exclusively male, intelligentsia. They wrote the documents and they preserved them. Universities, monasteries, dioceses, and the Roman Curia had the means and motive to preserve particular records, and modern scholars of necessity rely heavily upon them. Because of this clear bias, the picture presented here cannot be and will not be complete. In fact, given the assumptions of writers from the 13th century on that women could never have led the liturgy, it's pretty amazing that as much evidence exists as does. I mean, there's no reason to save any of these documents if they weren't supposed to exist. They would consider them anomalies and throw them out. A graffito. Now, a graffito, I don't know much about graffito. This is archaeology talk, and I'm not an archaeologist. The only digging I do is through books and wine racks. But it's a carved stone or slab of rock. Well, one of these, dated between the 4th and the 6th century and found near Poitiers in France, commemorates that, quote, Martia the priest, presbytera, made the offering together with Olybrius and Nepos. That's the monument. Scholars who've studied the carving agree that this inscription refers to Martia as a minister who celebrated the Eucharist along with two men, Olybrius and Nepos. All right? That's the clearest example we have. Not much doubt about that one. The Council of Nîmes, held in 394, noting that, quote, women seem to have been assumed into Levitical service, end quote, ordered that, quote, such ordination should be undone when it is effected contrary to reason. It should be seen that no one presume in the future, end quote. Now, it's quite likely that the ministry of women to which the ministry of women to the Eucharist was being discussed here, Levitical service. Scholars disagree whether that was either whether the women acted as priests or as deacons, but in one of those two roles they certainly acted, and that's what the council intended to forbid. Although it's interesting that it says, don't ordain them unreasonably. It's hard to know what the context there is. 100 years later, in the year 494, Pope Gelasius, in a letter to the bishops of southern Italy and Sicily, also spoke out against bishops who were allowing women to serve at the altar. Gelasius heard that, quote, women are confirmed to minister at the sacred altars and to perform all matters imputed only to the service of the male sex and for which women are not competent, end quote. The Italian scholar Giorgio Otranto makes clear in his analysis of this letter that Gelasius was directing his anger at the bishops who were ordaining women as priests, not at the women themselves. 15 years later, Bishops Licinius, Melonius, and Eustochius of northern Gaul wrote to priests from Brittany. They were furious to learn that the priests traveled with women who assisted them at the altar, quote, so that while you are distributing the Eucharist, they hold the chalices and presume to administer the blood of Christ to the people of God, end quote. These women are referred to by their companions as conhospitae, housemates, indicating that the women were more than likely their wives. The bishops upbraided the priests for, quote, this novelty and unheard of superstition that brings infamy upon the clergy and incurs shame and horror for the holy religion, end quote. The bishops demanded that, quote, these silly little women not pollute the holy sacraments by illicit assistance, end quote. Now, on the other hand, the letter implies that at least these priests and their congregations accepted the women as co-ministers of the Eucharist. And most likely these are just the wives of the priests. Priests and bishops and deacons were married until that was forbidden in the 12th century. Not all were married, but we don't know how many were married. Could have been a lot, could have been a little. It depends on which scholar you read. But they certainly were married. And there were hereditary bishoprics in England until the early 13th century, actually. So married clergy was fairly common at this time. In 747, Pope Zachary wrote to the Frankish authorities who wished to know if nuns could read the gospel or sing at Mass. Zachary replied in the negative and added, quote, "Nevertheless, as we have heard to our dismay, divine worship has fallen into such disdain that women have presumed to serve at the sacred altars, and that the female sex, to whom it does not belong, perform all the things that are assigned exclusively to men," unquote. Women, it seems, were still ministering at the altar in the mid-8th century. At the Council of Paris, held in 829, the bishops were appalled to learn that, quote, "In some provinces, in contradiction to the divine law and to canonical instruction, women betake themselves into the altar area and impudently take hold of the sacred vessels, hold out the priestly garments to the priest, and, what is worse, more indecent and unfitting than all this, they give the people the body and blood of the Lord and do other things which themselves are indecent," unquote. As in the 6th century, it appears that at least some priests and bishops were allowing women to minister at the altar. Perhaps they were participating as deaconesses or perhaps as priests. This depends on whether the things at which it would be shameful to mention refer to saying the Mass itself. A report to the bishops of the Acts of the Council from the same year make it clear that some bishops had been allowing the practice. Again, it's the bishops that they're angry with, not the women for doing this. Quote, "Doubtless it occurred through the carelessness and negligence of some bishops. They have given themselves to carnal passions and illicit actions, so that women, without anyone preventing them, betake themselves into the consecrated houses and therein have been able to introduce unpermitted things," unquote. Well, most likely these were married bishops. And so what they're saying, it's because your wife made you do this. Something like that. Okay. Now, it is true that sometimes the term presbytera refers to the wife of a priest, and sometimes the term episcopa, well, no, you almost never find episcopa referring to only one case I know of where you find episcopa referring to the wife of a bishop, usually not that. But diakona and diakonissa often refer to the wives of deacons, or can refer to the wives of deacons. But as I like to point out, I'm married myself, and just because you're married doesn't mean that exhausts your entire person. You might actually also have another job. You might also do other things. So I'm not quite convinced by the argument to say, well, yes, but that just means they were just the wives of priests, or just the wives of deacons, or just the wives of bishops. I think it meant more than that, and because spouses often do things besides just spouse. Now, there's no question that women distributed communion in the 10th, 11th, and perhaps the 12th century, and we know this because we have the liturgical texts. They still survive. There are two manuscripts from this period that have the liturgical texts. One comes from the 11th or 12th century at the Abbey of Santa Sofia in Benevento for use by nuns in that community. The second, although we don't know where the provenance of the manuscript, was also probably used by nuns. The famous medieval scholar and Benedictine monk Jean Leclerc notes, quote, "It's never said or supposed that the ones who recite these prayers is a priest. Nevertheless, in their ensemble, they really constitute a long Eucharistic prayer," unquote. The rite consists of a series of prayers followed by a communion service and prayers after communion. Again, according to Leclerc, note that this ensemble, which makes up the opening prayers, corresponds more or less to the series of texts which serve as an introduction to the Mass: entrance psalm, litany, penitential rite, collect, and profession of faith, end quote. While these rites for women do not seem to be masses, it's hard to know, they are very close to them and indicate that women were still involved in service at the altar, despite the many injunctions against them doing so in the 11th and 12th century. Also, these books were used. First of all, they look like they were used, and secondly, as Jean Leclerc also points out, you don't make liturgical books unless you're going to use them because they're way too expensive. You just would not put all the money into it. We actually have an example, though, of a communion, such a communion, mentioned by the 9th century hagiographer of St. Odila. The holy woman died while her sisters were in prayer. Alarmed that Odila had died without receiving the body and blood of Christ, they prayed that her soul would return to her body. The miracle was granted, although Adila was pretty upset about it. It's what they say. I wasn't there. And, and our writer continues, quote, "And when the chalice in which our Lord's body and blood were contained was ordered to be brought to her, accepting it with her own hands and participating in the Holy Communion, she handed over to her soul while all watched." The hagiographer seems to have no problem with nuns handling the consecrated species, with St. Odila touching the chalice, and with the nuns performing their own communion rite. Now, I'm going to watch my time a little bit here. Oh dear. Oh dear. Well, I want to talk about nuns. I want to talk about abbesses as bishops. So let me just say briefly that nuns also heard confessions. They heard, one of the main jobs of an abbess was to hear the confession of her congregation. It's extremely important in the ordos, in the rules for nuns. That's the number one job that an abbess has, is to hear the confessions of her nuns. But abbesses also heard the confessions of other people. According to the life of St. Bertilla, she heard confessions for the entire surrounding area. Quote, "Bertilla drew the family of the monastery or the surrounding neighbors through Holy Communion." I'm not sure what that means. There's a couple of meanings for that, but one, of course, would mean that she had the liturgy. "So that, hearing their confessions, they would do penance for their sins," unquote. The family of the monastery would include, in this case, all those who worked in and for the monastery, including the peasant farmers from the villages owned by the monastery. St. Ide heard the confession and gave penance to a murderer who sought her out to hear her confession. When he refused to complete his penance, she had to give him another penance that he finally fulfilled. Abbesses then, for several centuries, were recognized as the ordinary ministers of penance for their own monastic community, and sometimes even exercised power outside that circle. This was one of the most important liturgical functions attached to the order of abbess. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the abbesses who acted as bishops. There aren't so many, there aren't all that many references to women who acted as bishops. Let's see if I can do this here. Oh boy, I haven't got a pointer. Uh-oh, how do I get it go back and forth? Oh, wait a minute, I think I can figure this. I think I got it. Dong, there we go. This is the most important of the monuments that we have. This is a very, very bad picture of a mosaic in Rome that says Theodora Episcopa. This is probably one of the most famous references to a woman as bishop. It's an inscription, and this is in the chapel of St. Zeno in the Church of Santa Sofia in Rome. We know quite a bit about Theodora, in fact. She was the mother of Pope Paschal I, who was Pope in the 9th century. We know the father of Paschal I. His name was Bonosus. As far as we know, he wasn't a clergyman at all, so Theodora was not the wife of a bishop. We know that this is a woman who was called a bishop. Don't know exactly what she did, but not because she was the wife of a bishop. There is another tomb dated somewhere between the 4th and 6th century, and it's inscribed to the venerable woman Episcopa Q. Again, we don't know anything about her except that she was called a bishop. We do have a description of the ordination of a woman as a bishop. It's an amazing story, and this is of Bridget of Ireland. Yes. Now, hundreds of years after Bridget had died, a life of her was written, partly in Celtic, partly in Latin, called the Betubricte. I don't know Celtic at all, so fortunately the part that I looked at was written in Latin. And it describes how Bridget was ordained. Quote, "The bishop being intoxicated with the grace of God." This was Satan Mel. Come on. "Did not recognize what he was reciting from his book." He opened it up to the wrong page. He did, yeah. "And he consecrated Bridget with the order of a bishop. This virgin alone in Ireland," said Mel, "will hold the episcopal ordination." All right. I used to say that she was the only virgin bishop in Ireland. But okay. Now, while she was being consecrated, a fiery column ascended from her head. So God affirms her ordination. The reference is extraordinary for several reasons. First, Bridget was described as actually ordained to the episcopacy. She was not referred to as a bishop out of courtesy or metaphorically. She was really ordained, even if by accident, and even if uniquely. Secondly, there's no question that the ordination took. As Bishop Mal realized, Bridget, once consecrated, was a bishop. At least for this 9th century Irish writer, a woman could be ordained and even be ordained a bishop. There's another reference, one further reference is to Matilda, the daughter of Otto I, the Emperor Otto I. Matilda died in 999, and when she was buried, on her tomb, she's referred to as Metropolitana of Quedlinburg. Metropolitanus is a word that's almost always means archbishop. And so Metropolitana would have meant that she acted as archbishop. Occasionally, very rarely, it's used for an abbot, but then it could have been an abbot who also had episcopal power. The one bishop, though, the one woman in a position where she really acted as bishop is the one I mentioned before, and that's the last reference that I'll give you, and that's to the Abbess of Las Huelgas. And this is the Abbey of Las Huelgas as it still exists today. And this is one of the famous abbesses of Las Huelgas. They were mostly royal people, very powerful. This is Anna of Austria. She was Abbess of Las Huelgas right after Trent. Trent passed a law saying there will be no more of these women who act as bishops. She wrote to the Pope and said, "And how, Your Excellency, does that apply to us?" And he said, "Oh, it doesn't apply to you. Don't worry, don't worry." The powerful Cistercian abbess of Las Huelgas near Burgos clearly acted as a bishop. She wore her mitre and carried her crosier until she was finally forbidden to do so in 1873. The history of Las Huelgas is impressive. Alfonso VIII of Castile and his wife Eleanor of England, daughter of the more famous Eleanor of Aquitaine, decided to establish the monastery of Las Huelgas after Alfonso's victory over the Muslim armies at Cuenca in 1178. Over the centuries, the abbess accumulated complete ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the territory, villages, and villas subject to Las Huelgas. She had the power to appoint parish priests for the countryside subject to the convent of Las Huelgas, and this involved some 64 villages. She could establish new parishes. She could unite parish churches or reopen closed churches. She could approve confessors for all her subjects and examine their credentials if necessary. Priests appointed by the abbess could not only hear the confessions of those under her care, but also the confessions of pilgrims and strangers. Apart from and alongside the power the abbess had over her own clergy, she also had the power to confer licenses to say Mass, to hear confessions, or preach in those areas subject to her control. She could punish or confront any preacher in her diocese if he was preaching heresy. She had the authority to authorize her subjects to proceed to holy orders, and she issued wedding licenses. No bishop or delegate from the Holy See could perform a visitation of the churches or altars or curates or clarets or benefices under the care of the abbess. The Pope could not investigate. She could commute last will and testaments when there was just cause. She had the power to visit and examine the adequacy of the apostolic, imperial, or royal notaries, and if she found them delinquent in their duty, she could punish them or prohibit them from office. Finally, the Abbess of Las Huelgas was able to convene a synod in her diocese and make synodal constitutions and laws for both her religious and lay subjects. One or all of these extraordinary powers were confirmed by Pope Honorius III in 1219, Gregory IX in 1234, Innocent IV in 1248, and again in 1252. Only in 1873, after 700 years, Pope Pius IX, in his decree Quae Diversa, put an end to the episcopal powers of the abbesses of Las Huelgas. The abbess, Doña Maria del Pilar Ugarte, mounted a spirited legal defense, but to no avail. On October 1st, 1874, she wrote to the daughter houses of Las Huelgas, informing them that Las Huelgas was now under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Burgos. Now, there might have been other abbesses that powerful in the Middle Ages. There's suggestions that several were, but we have more records on this particular abbess than anyone else. And that's an interesting story too, but I better conclude. So let me conclude. Oh, wait, I'm not done. I know you're desperate. But I want to talk about one more thing. The historical information gathered over the last 50 years demonstrates fairly conclusively that women have been ordained in the past. But if this is so obvious, why is it that so many theologians and even some historians have tenaciously continued to assert that women were never really ordained? Now, I believe the central problem here is a confusion of historical and theological claims. Historians have a relatively easy task in deciding if women were ordained. Were women considered ordained by their contemporaries? Did they undergo rites called ordinations by their contemporaries? Was the same concept of ordination applied equally to women and men? If the answer to these questions is yes, then women were ordained. Period. For historians. And since the answer, in fact, to these questions is yes, for historians, women were ordained. Okay. Wait. Hold your applause, because it's more complicated if you're asking a theologian if women were ordained. I know. Okay. Well, let me give you an example of what I mean. Elizabeth I of England was considered, eventually, by her contemporaries as queen. She was consecrated as a queen, she acted as she were queen, and at least by the time of her death, there was little question about that in the realm of England, and if you questioned it, your own death might be at issue. Now, Elizabeth II is also considered by her contemporaries to be a queen. She was consecrated as a queen and acts as if she is queen. Of course, if anyone did doubt it, and I can't imagine anyone would, death would not result. As far as historians are concerned, they're both queens. All right? However, they have far different powers and roles as queen. Elizabeth I both reigned and ruled. She made laws and enforced them with all the power of the state behind her. Elizabeth II gives the occasional inspiring speech and tries to keep her children and grandchildren out of the tabloid press. That's it. Now, historians don't ask if Elizabeth II is really a queen because she has little, if any, of the power associated with the queens of the past. This, however, would be a valid question for philosophers or theologians or political scientists. What makes someone a real queen? Does a real queen have to both rule and reign? Political scientists can ask this question. So theologians have a tougher job than historians. Ordination in the past, as Congar, for instance, has clearly pointed out, was understood differently in the past than in the present. Being ordained in the 10th century meant something quite different than it would in the 21st century. Just as being Queen of England in the 16th century meant something quite different than it means to be Queen of England now. So theologians have to determine which definition of ordination is the correct one, the real one, the one God wants, and then determine if ordinations of women in the past fit that definition. All right? So, what I would like to suggest is that the question of whether women were ordained in the past or not is more a theological question than it is an historical question. Or to put it more accurately, the question whether women were really ordained in the past is definitely a theological question. The historical question at this point is not even interesting. The question comes down to what counts as real ordination, and this is a question historians cannot solve. Now, theology is its own discipline, and it has its own rules and its own methods, and one can make an argument on either side of this question. And I've made some of those arguments, and I've analyzed some of those arguments. But you have to make those arguments. You can't just say they weren't, or you can't just say they were. You have to say what you mean by that, and how that relates to the present. If you want to talk theologically, if you want to just talking historically, no. One has to prove that the definition being used or presumed in either of those statements is theologically sound. That is to say, women were ordained in the past and then should be in the present is the assumption. Or they were not ordained in the past, and then the assumption being they should not be ordained in the present. But you have to make those theological arguments. All right? They're very interesting theological arguments. And I suggest to you that if you start talking about this theologically and not historically, we'll make a lot more progress on the question. And secondly, I think you will quickly find that it's really a question of authority. Who decides? All right? Who decides what real ordination is, and therefore what real ordination was, in a way, in an interesting way? But that's a whole other kettle of fish. All right, I can give another talk on that another time. In fact, you have people in the audience, that I can see some of them, who could give you better talks on that whole issue, okay? And I want to leave enough time for us to talk about some of the implications of this for the present and so on. So I thank you very much, but that's as much data as I will bore you with tonight. That's pretty good.